fantasy, football, fantasy, 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 football, fantasy. If you like football and you like fantasy, fantasy, football, fantasy.
He's a guy who, because he didn't play, took a team who perennially wins their division, who's always hosting a playoff game. So if we're talking about the impact that a certain player had on the success or failure of his team, Peyton Manning may need to be number one.
Should keep the top 100 of people who actually play, but I don't think we really knew his impact until he wasn't there playing.
If you look at players who either on or off the field had the biggest impact on the season, you have to put Peyton Manning on there.
Being a kid can be harder than it looks. Sometimes it helps to have an adult around. That's why Peyton Manning takes time out to volunteer with local youth groups.
You guys ready to play some football?
Yeah!
55 Razor! Sit! Open, get open. Get your head out of your ass! You suck! Then you just push it a little further and you should hear a click.
Why don't we just use your keys?
I told you, I forgot them. Cops, every minute.
Business as usual for him, you know. When I see his interviews, he's just, you know, I could have did this better. And I'm like, Peyton, no, you couldn't have.
Okay, I'm sorry. Do you want to lose? I throw, you catch. It's not that hard, okay? All right, get the out of here.
When I look at who has the best season, it's what's your job description? How well did you do it? And did you do it better than everyone else? And I think that he did.
Peyton Manning equals the best. There's really nothing else to say. You know, there's no argument about it. He's the best in the NFL right now.
Back at him, back at him.
Yeah. There's a fantasy channel that you've got to see.
It's like a fantasy, football fantasy.
Like catching a football that came from me.
Then opening it up, look, there's Nacho Cheese. Fantasy, fantasy, football, fantasy, 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 football, fantasy.
Like an end zone that ends in a waterfall.
A shower that showers you in tiny footballs.
It's a football fantasy like no other.
Like having a best friend that's your quarterback brother. Fantasy, fantasy, football, fantasy, 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 football, fantasy. If you like football and you like fantasy, fantasy, football, fantasy. Everybody dies, but not everybody lives. They tell us we should grow up, but we only just some kids. Only got one life, you ain't gonna live it twice, so you better do it right. We all gonna slow down